Welcome to African Horizon. Today I'm going to provide a realistic and balanced assessment of Chinese infrastructure projects across Africa. First of all, I want to thank subscribers on our YouTube channel and others who've sent questions regarding previous videos I made about Chinese infrastructure projects across Africa. Very important questions that have been raised, and because of this, I'm going to make this new video on a more, a realistic and balanced assessment of Chinese infrastructure projects across Africa. Another reason for why I want to do this is because, unfortunately, a lot of Western journalists and analysts out there are writing very much one-sided and a lot of incorrect information. And unfortunately, a lot of the journalists and analysts I see they're writing about Chinese infrastructure in Africa are not providing the strategic understanding and the strategic insights that are useful and relevant to truly understand Chinese infrastructure across Africa. So first of all, a little background. I personally have traveled by public bus across 30 countries on the ground across Western, Southern, and Eastern Africa. I've been to 42 countries in Africa in total. Now there are 54, so I do have a few left, and I will continue traveling in Africa for years to come. However, I've been traveling by public bus alone across Western Africa several times, across Southern Africa several times, and across Eastern Africa several times. So I have seen border crossings, infrastructure corridors, I've seen roads, I've seen ports, I've seen vast areas and territories across the African continent myself on the ground. Now, a lot of the Western journalists and analysts out there, they haven't traveled that much. They don't have that on the ground experience. Now, some of them may have traveled a bit, but not to the extent that I have been on the ground. In addition, I've talked to a lot of people to get a realistic understanding of the developments across Africa, because that is absolutely critical. Therefore, large territories across the African continent, people live in extreme poverty. Large areas do not have the infrastructure capacity or the roads or connectivity that is so important to have economic development and economic growth. Therefore, over the years now, Chinese infrastructure companies and industrial companies and energy companies have been doing a very important work in developing infrastructure across the African continent. Now, there are other countries and companies from other countries also doing infrastructure projects across Africa. That is important to mention. However, China is by far the largest infrastructure operator on the ground across Africa. And remember, there are 54 countries in Africa, and Chinese companies are really operating in most of the countries across the African continent. Therefore, in order for these countries and large areas that have been really truly suffering because of a lack of infrastructure, a lack of economic opportunity, and people have been living in extreme conditions, and I've seen it myself on the ground, because of these extreme conditions, creating major refugee crises, creating internal conflicts, creating wars, and a range of other risks. Because of this, what Chinese infrastructure companies and industrial companies have been doing in building infrastructure across the African continent is absolutely essential. Now, let's look back a little bit. After the end of the Cold War, the United States gained supremacy in the world as the leading superpower. Unfortunately, the United States did not have the capacity nor the will and the intention to build any infrastructure around the world. Therefore, the United States, over the last 30 years, has not built any infrastructure around the world, not in Africa, nor in other areas, not even in Central America, which is why we see the ongoing refugee crisis towards the US border across Central America, and recently from even Haiti. So, back to the importance of infrastructure in Africa. It is absolutely critical for African countries now to have more infrastructure development, more industrial development, creating job opportunities, economic growth, a more sustainable economy with large opportunities in the future. We must remember, the UN forecast for the world's population in 2100, that's only 79 years from now. The UN forecast is that the world is going to have approximately 11 billion people. Now, 40% of that will be living in Africa. So more than 4 billion people will probably live in Africa in the year 2100. That means almost a tripling of the current rate. The current population in Africa is approximately 1.3 billion. So that means 3 times more, up to 4 billion people will be living in Africa. Now think about that. Now, 79 years may seem like a long, long time, but in reality, in the evolution of countries and societies, it's not that long. Therefore, it's absolutely critical that we see more infrastructure development, more economic development across the African continent in the coming years. Now, to what Western journalists are talking about, Chinese infrastructure companies should be releasing their contracts and their loan agreements. First of all, this notion that Chinese countries, that African countries now are sent into debt traps is just not a fair assessment. First of all, Chinese companies operating across the African continent are doing this for business. There are business contracts that are signed and that are developed, and there are vast loan agreements because Chinese banks and Chinese financial institutions are supplying and providing a lot of loans for a range of African countries so that they can develop this infrastructure. That is absolutely important. Now, there are challenging conditions, and there are certainly also going to be challenges for many countries with these loans because they do not have much of a financial stability or good financial situation at the outset. So there are certainly going to be challenges. But I mean, first of all, we have to look at the conditions. A lot of, or almost all African countries, many of them really had very little or limited infrastructure. So what Chinese companies now are building is from really kind of a basic level of very limited infrastructure. So there's just a vast need of infrastructure to develop going forward. And that is why there are so many projects, so many contracts, and that's also why we see the debts increasing for a lot of countries, for example, with Kenya and other countries. Now, the Kenyan government is dealing with this, as are other African governments as well, and they're also negotiating with Chinese companies and the Chinese government about these debt developments. So that is another aspect. However, what is so unfortunate is that Western journalists and analysts so often are just completely one-sided, constantly just criticizing Chinese infrastructure projects and Chinese companies and China in general in a very one-sided and negative manner, when in fact, what Chinese infrastructure companies and China is really doing in Africa is very, very important. Now, going forward, President Biden has been talking about the US is going to increase its infrastructure connectivity and capacity around the world, building a G7 infrastructure project going forward to really develop infrastructure. I'm not sure if it's going to happen. I hope they succeed because there is still such a vast need for infrastructure across the African continent and around the world. So stepping back, it is very much time for a realistic and balanced assessment of Chinese infrastructure projects across the African continent. And it's very important to state that Chinese infrastructure projects across the African continent are very important because the alternative would be very little infrastructure development across the African continent. And that could create a very severe situation. Countries could be collapsing, and also the wars and conflicts and refugee crisis that we've already seen plaguing various countries across the African continent would just compound and increase. So therefore, it is time for a balanced and realistic assessment of Chinese infrastructure projects across the African continent. And going forward, for Western journalists and analysts writing a lot of times what I see as very much incorrect and unbalanced assessment, I would urge Western journalists and analysts to travel on the ground across the African continent to see for yourselves and create a more balanced understanding of realities on the ground. That is critical. Now, I look forward to traveling much more across the African continent in the future to see more developments, learn more from different countries, meet more African people, because what is really interesting is that the most balanced assessments that we can read today about Chinese infrastructure projects across the African continent often come from African journalists themselves. Recently, I read a great article in the East African, a great newspaper, and there was a very important article about how Chinese trained African workers now are managing and running infrastructure projects across Kenya. For example, the expressway now being built in Nairobi. You can see a lot of Kenyan infrastructure workers on the ground building the express highway across Nairobi. They've been trained on Chinese infrastructure projects. So again, we're seeing now the importance of Chinese infrastructure companies and projects across Africa. They are training a large amounts of African workers, so they're becoming skilled, technically skilled, so they themselves now in the future can also manage and develop locally developed infrastructure projects across the African continent. So that goes back. What Chinese companies are doing across Africa is very important. And that is what I wanted to say today. So thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to welcome you again. And please remember to subscribe to African Horizon. Thank you very much.